groaned in response, a low, tectonic vibration that shook the ground beneath the wolf. A tether of shimmering energy shot from the ship's core, wrapping around the wolf's torso and pulling him tight against the hull. The wolf clawed at the ground, but the magnetic lock held firm. The ship's engines roared to life, a sound like grinding stone that vibrated deep in the fawn's chest. The wolf was yanked off his feet, his body pinned against the side of the rising craft by the shimmering energy tether. He clawed at the air, his boots scraping uselessly against the metal plating as he was dragged into the wake of the thrusters.
This is how it all began, one fine morning while Pippin was walking in the forest.
The forest floor was a thick carpet of damp moss and decaying leaves. The fawn moved with a steady, rhythmic gait, his hooves sinking into the soft earth with every step. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, golden needles, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. He pushed through a dense wall of ferns, his head low, tracking the scent of damp soil. Suddenly, his front hoof struck something that did not yield. It was not wood, nor stone. He pulled back, shaking his hoof, and looked down. Half buried in the dirt, a jagged edge of translucent material caught the light. He scraped away the loose soil with his foreleg, revealing a shard of rock that hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. It pulsed with a rhythmic violet light, a steady heartbeat of energy. It seemed to breathe against the surrounding darkness. As the light intensified, the leaves nearby began to curl, their edges turning brittle and brown. The fawn stood frozen, his ears twitching at the strange, metallic resonance filling the clearing. He lowered his head, his breath hitching. The fawn did not pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, his nose inches from the violet glow. The vibration traveled up his legs, a hum that rattled his very bones. High above, a sharp, piercing squawk tore through the quiet. A blue jay dropped from the branches, landing on a low, twisted limb, just feet away. The bird was a blur of frantic motion, his head snapping back and forth, eyes locked onto the glowing shard with undisguised terror. "Drop it!" the blue jay screeched, his wings beating against the air in a rapid, uneven rhythm. "That thing does not belong in the dirt. It is poison." The fawn blinked, his gaze shifting from the pulsing stone to the bird. He did not move. He did not understand the fear. The blue jay hopped closer, his claws digging deep into the bark of the branch, his chest heaving with every breath. "Do you not see the leaves?" the bird hissed, pointing a wing toward the withered foliage. "It is eating the life out of the ground. Leave it. Walk away before it drags us both into something we cannot escape." The blue jay vanished into the canopy, his frantic cries fading into the distance. The fawn remained, the silence of the woods returning with a heavier, more oppressive weight. He reached out, his hoof finally making contact with the jagged surface of the crystal. It was cold, yet it burned against his skin. A sudden, sharp pulse of violet light surged through his leg, grounding him to the stone. He tried to pull back, to retreat, but his muscles refused to obey. The hum had changed. It was no longer a vibration, but a command. The crystal pulled him forward, a magnetic tether dragging him toward the heart of the forest. He walked, not by choice, but because the earth itself seemed to tilt in that direction. He bypassed the familiar trails and pushed through thickets of thorns that tore at his fur. The forest grew darker, the trees knitting together into a wall of ancient, gnarled roots. He reached a clearing where the roots arched high, forming a natural gate to a hidden grotto. The pull intensified, drawing him toward the threshold. He stood at the edge, his heart hammering against his ribs, staring into the deep, shadowed interior of the grotto. The crystal in his grasp flared, casting long, dancing violet shadows against the stone walls. He took one step forward, crossing the line, and the woods behind him fell into a sudden, absolute stillness. The stillness at the grotto entrance lasted only a heartbeat. Then, the air pressure plummeted. The fawn's ears twitched, swiveling toward the sky as a low-frequency drone began to vibrate the ground. Above the canopy, the clouds were not merely parting, they were being torn aside. A streak of blinding white light cut through. The fawn stumbled back, his eyes wide, watching as the treetops bent and snapped under a sudden, violent gale. Birds erupted from the branches in a panicked, swirling mass, their cries lost in the growing thunder. A silver shape, jagged and impossibly fast, plummeted toward the earth. It hammered into the forest floor. A long, smoking trench carved itself through the undergrowth, leveling everything in its path. The ground heaved, the air filled with the sharp, acrid scent of ozone and scorched earth, and the silence was broken only by the hiss of cooling metal. The fawn scrambled to his feet, his hooves sliding on the loose, charred dirt. He turned to run, but a sharp, rhythmic hiss froze him in place. A section of the silver hull shifted, folding inward with a series of mechanical clicks. Steam billowed from the breach, obscuring the interior for a long, suffocating moment. Then, a heavy boot struck the forest floor. It was not flesh and bone, but dark, polished metal that absorbed the remaining light. A figure stepped out from the wreckage. He stood tall, his frame rigid and imposing, moving with a calculated, predatory grace that ignored the surrounding destruction. He did not look at the ruined trees or the smoking crater. His head turned in a slow, precise arc, the red visor glowing with a steady, piercing intensity. The light swept across the ferns, the gnarled roots, and the fawn, lingering for a fraction of a second before moving on. The figure adjusted his stance, the joints of his limbs whirring softly in the quiet air. He was a creature of cold geometry in a world of wild, organic chaos. He paused, his head snapping toward the fawn's position as the red light locked onto the pulsing violet glow of the crystal. The scan was complete. The hunter had found his mark. The wolf closed the distance in 3 long, heavy strides. Every movement was efficient, devoid of hesitation. He stopped just feet away, the red glow of his visor reflecting in the fawn's wide eyes. The wolf raised a metallic gauntlet, the fingers flexing with a sharp, hydraulic whine. "Hand over the core, creature," the machine voice commanded, vibrating through the humid air. "It belongs to the stars, not the soil." The fawn did not retreat. He felt the hum of the crystal against his chest, a warm, steady pulse that countered the cold presence of the intruder. He lowered his head, his hooves digging deep into the mossy earth to anchor himself. He shifted his body, placing his frame between the wolf and the grotto entrance. The fawn looked up, his gaze meeting the unblinking red light of the visor. "It belongs to the forest," the fawn bleated, his voice steady despite the tremor in his legs. The wolf tilted his head, the internal sensors whirring as he processed the defiance. The air grew thick with tension, the silence of the woods pressing in. High above the confrontation, the blue jay erupted into a flurry of motion. He dove from his perch, wings snapping against the air in a frantic, uneven rhythm. He landed on a low-hanging branch just inches from the fawn, his head jerking from side to side, eyes wide and darting. "Drop it!" the bird squawked, his voice cracking with a high, piercing desperation. "Look at him! He is made of steel and death!" The blue jay fluttered his wings, kicking up a cloud of dust as he hopped along the branch. He leaned toward the fawn, his beak clicking against the wood. "We are outmatched! Do you want us to be vaporized? He will burn this entire grove to ash just to get that stone." The bird took flight again, circling the fawn's head, his shadow flickering over the mossy ground. He tried to peck at the fawn's ears, urging him to move, to run, to surrender the crystal before the inevitable end. The fawn did not blink. He stood rooted to the earth, his muscles tense, his focus locked entirely on the grotto entrance. The blue jay let out a final shrill cry of frustration and retreated to a higher branch, his body trembling as he watched the wolf. The wolf did not raise his voice. He simply tapped a sequence into the console on his wrist. A sharp, high-pitched whine emanated from his back, followed by the sound of metal plates sliding open. From the hollow of his shoulder, a swarm of miniature drones detached. They hovered for a split second, their rotors a blur of motion, before fanning out into the canopy. The fawn watched as the devices drifted downward, their movements jerky and unnatural. Suddenly, a series of thin crimson beams cut through the gloom. The drones were scanning. A red dot appeared on the fawn's shoulder, then another on his flank, and a third burned bright against his forehead. The lasers traced his movements, painting his fur with a web of targeting reticles. The fawn felt the heat of the beams against his skin. The drones buzzed in a tight, synchronized orbit, their sensors clicking as they calculated the optimal angle for a strike. The red dots burned against the fawn's hide, steady and unblinking. He felt the vibration of the drones in his marrow, a low-frequency thrum that made the very air feel heavy. He did not look at the wolf. He did not look at the blue jay. His gaze remained fixed on the dark, arched opening of the grotto, a narrow gap between ancient roots that promised safety. The lead drone, hovering just feet from his face, tilted its lens. A sharp, piercing whine began to build, rising in pitch until it sounded like a needle scraping against glass. The fawn's ears twitched, catching the shift in the machine's energy output. He felt the heat of the laser intensify, a concentrated point of light searing into his skin. His muscles tightened, the tendons in his legs pulling taut as he prepared to launch. He shifted his weight to his back hooves, digging deep into the soft, damp moss. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The wind died, and the leaves stopped their rustle. The drone's hum peaked, a final, lethal note that signaled the end of the standoff. The fawn's pupils dilated, his entire being focused on the singular path ahead. He was no longer a creature of the meadow, but a coiled spring of pure, desperate motion. He waited for the first spark of discharge, his body ready to shatter the silence. The first beam scorched the air, turning a nearby fern into ash. The fawn bolted, his hooves hammered the earth, spraying mud and pine needles in his wake. He did not look back. He drove himself into the dense thicket, his body low to the ground, muscles firing in a desperate rhythm. Behind him, the air hissed. A laser bolt struck the trunk of a towering oak, sending a spray of wood chips flying into his path. He swerved, his hooves sliding on the slick moss, and dove beneath a tangle of low-hanging branches. Another beam followed, slicing through the leaves just inches from his ears. The smell of ozone and charred bark filled his nostrils. He pushed harder, his lungs burning, his legs a blur of motion as he wove through the labyrinth of trees. The drones were relentless, their hum a constant grating drone that grew louder with every turn. He leaped over a fallen log, his body arching in the air, and landed hard on the other side. A bolt grazed his flank, searing the skin, but he did not slow. He banked sharply around a stone outcropping, using the terrain to break their line of sight. The forest was a chaotic blur of green and brown, and the gap between him and the machines was closing. A shadow flickered above the canopy. The blue jay did not flee. He plummeted. He tucked his wings and became a streak of blue, diving directly into the center of the drone swarm. His beak struck the lead drone's optical sensor with a sharp metallic click. The drone wobbled, its red laser beams swinging wildly. The blue jay banked, his wings beating against the heavy air, and slammed into the side of a second unit. Sparks showered the moss like falling stars. The drones, locked in a rigid formation, struggled to compensate. The blue jay darted between them, pecking at wires and exposed circuitry. One drone spiraled, its rotors clipping the edge of a third unit. The air cleared of the constant, high-pitched hum. The red dots that had painted the fawn's fur vanished. The blue jay pulled up, landing on a branch, his chest heaving. He let out a sharp, triumphant cry. The silence lasted only a heartbeat. Then, the ground began to shudder. It was not the high-pitched whine of drones, but a deep, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the fawn's hooves. Every impact was heavy, deliberate, and absolute. The fawn turned his head, ears swiveling toward the source of the disturbance. Through the dense wall of ferns, a figure emerged. The wolf moved with a terrifying mechanical precision. He did not dodge the undergrowth, he obliterated it. His heavy boots descended with the force of falling stone, snapping thick roots and crushing saplings into the mud. He stepped over a fallen log, his weight causing the wood to splinter underfoot. There was no wasted motion in his stride. He scanned the clearing, his visor glowing with a steady, predatory red light that cut through the shadows of the canopy. He reached out, pushing aside a heavy branch with a gauntlet that hissed with hydraulic pressure. The forest floor groaned under his mass. The fawn felt the air grow cold as the wolf locked onto his position. The predator took another step, his heavy boots sinking deep into the soft earth, leaving a crater in the moss. The fawn knew the flat forest floor was a death trap. He pivoted, his hooves digging into the loam as he banked sharply toward the rising slope. Behind him, the rhythmic thud of the wolf's pursuit grew louder, a mechanical cadence that refused to falter. The fawn pushed harder, his muscles coiled and straining. He leaped over a sprawling root system, landing on a patch of loose shale that clattered down into the darkness below. He was leading the hunter toward the edge. The trees began to thin, replaced by the sharp, jagged silhouette of the ravine. The air here was thinner, smelling of damp stone and ancient decay. The fawn's heart hammered against his ribs, but his path remained true. He darted between two narrow rock pillars, his body brushing against the cold, unyielding stone. The wolf followed, his heavy boots skidding on the shifting gravel. Each step the predator took sent a cascade of rocks tumbling into the abyss. The ground beneath them grew narrow, a precarious bridge of earth suspended over the deep, silent gorge. The fawn did not look back. He felt the vibration of the wolf's heavy impact just feet behind him, the metal giant closing the distance with every crashing stride. The fawn hit the edge of the ravine and stopped dead. His hooves skidded, sending a spray of loose pebbles into the void. He stood motionless, a statue of fur and bone, staring into the empty air. The wolf saw the opening. He surged forward, his hydraulic joints hissing as he threw his entire mass into a final, lunging strike. He expected the fawn to flee, but the prey had vanished from his path. The wolf's momentum was too great to check. His heavy boots struck the unstable lip of the cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his weight. He staggered, arms windmilling to find balance on the treacherous edge. High above, a shadow detached itself from the canopy. The blue jay released his grip on a massive rock log. It plummeted with the force of a falling hammer. The wind struck the wolf's leg with a sickening crunch, pinning the limb firmly against the hard-packed earth. The wolf roared, his internal fans spinning, to a high-pitched whine as he clawed at the dirt. He was anchored. The predator was now the prisoner, his heavy frame tilted precariously toward the drop. The drones hovered in a tight formation, their red laser sights flickering across the fawn's flank. They sensed the wolf's distress, their rotors whining as they prepared to fire. Suddenly, the ground beneath the drones began to ripple. Thick, dark vines erupted from the moss, moving with a fluid, predatory speed that defied their organic nature. These were not mere plants. They were conduits of the forest's hidden magnetic core. The vines whipped upward, lashing out like iron cables. They coiled around the drones, their surfaces glowing with a faint, pulsating violet light. The machines struggled, their thrusters firing in frantic, uneven bursts, but the grip tightened. Metal groaned under the pressure. One by one, the drones were pulled downward, their sensors crushed. As the vines squeezed the life out of their circuitry, sparks showered the forest floor, illuminating the dark grotto with short-lived, brilliant flashes. The vines retracted, dragging the twisted husks into the deep, damp soil. The wolf, still pinned by the log, watched his technological support disappear. The fawn stepped over the smoldering debris toward the center of the crash site. The ship lay half-buried in the trench, its hull plates warped and venting thin wisps of gray smoke. He ignored the heat radiating from the metal and moved toward the primary console, which sat exposed near the fractured bulkhead. His hooves clicked against the jagged floor panels as he approached the glowing, recessed terminal. He did not understand the language of the stars, but he recognized the pulsing rhythm of the emergency beacon. It matched the hum of the crystal he carried. He pressed his nose against the interface, triggering a sequence of sharp blue light pulses. The console chirped, a series of rapid, high-frequency tones that echoed through the ravine. He swiped his hoof across the glass, locking the coordinates to the wolf's home planet. Groaned in response, a low, tectonic vibration that shook the ground beneath the wolf. A tether of shimmering energy shot from the ship's core, wrapping around the wolf's torso and pulling him tight against the hull. The wolf clawed at the ground, but the magnetic lock held firm. The ship's engines roared to life, a sound like grinding stone that vibrated deep in the fawn's chest. Dust and loose debris spiraled upward, caught in the sudden, violent updraft. The vessel shuddered, its hull lifting inches off the scarred earth before surging with blinding intensity. The wolf was yanked off his feet, his body pinned against the side of the rising craft by the shimmering energy tether. He clawed at the air, his boots scraping uselessly against the metal plating as he was dragged into the wake of the thrusters. The ship tilted, clearing the ravine walls with inches to spare. Trees swayed violently, their branches whipping in the wake. He watched as the vessel gained altitude, a streak of silver against the darkening sky. The wolf's frantic movements grew smaller. The pressure in the air dropped instantly, leaving a hollow, ringing silence in the wake of the departure. The ravine was still, save for the settling of loose shale and the faint, rhythmic dripping of water from the cliffside. The fawn shook the dust from his coat and turned away from the empty trench. He moved with a deliberate, steady gait, his hooves finding purchase on the mossy stones that had been trampled during the chase. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the canopy overhead slowly uncurling as the residual heat from the ship dissipated into the cool evening air. He climbed the narrow incline toward the grotto, his eyes fixed on the interlocking roots that shielded the sacred space. He pushed through the thick, woven barrier, stepping into the dim, quiet sanctuary where the air felt heavy and ancient. In the center stood the pedestal, a jagged spire of weathered rock waiting for its heart. He approached it slowly, the crystal in his grasp humming, a low, steady note that resonated against the stone. With a final, gentle movement, he lowered his head and set the object into the waiting depression. The ground beneath the pedestal shuddered, not with violence, but with a sudden, surging vitality. Where the violet light seeped into the soil, emerald moss erupted in thick, velvety patches. Tiny, translucent buds spiraled upward from the dirt, unfurling into wide, glowing petals that cast a soft luminescence across the grotto walls. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and sweet nectar. Vines, once withered and gray, turned a deep, healthy green, weaving themselves into intricate patterns along the ancient roots. The blue jay landed on a low-hanging branch, his head darting back and forth as he watched the transformation. He let out a single soft chirp, his wings folded tight against his sides. The fawn stood motionless, his hooves anchored in the lush, rapidly spreading clover. Every breath he drew felt cleaner, sharper, as the forest reclaimed its strength. The grotto was no longer a hidden sanctuary of stone, but a vibrant, living heart. Colors deepened, leaves shimmered with renewed vigor, and the silence was replaced by the gentle rustle of a thriving, restored paradise. The cycle was complete.